Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm really delighted that we can launch the third in a trilogy today by our very special director of the Turkish research program, Soner Cagaptay. I was just watching the UN General Assembly, and I have to extend a special thanks to the leader of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, who provided perfect context for today's event with his UNGA speech. We are, of course, today celebrating the release of Erdogan's empire, in which Soner argues that Mr. Erdogan is in some sense recreating, refashioning Ottoman history and bringing back the Ottoman spirit in today's Turkish foreign policy. And there on the screen just half an hour ago, there was the head of Turkey talking about former Ottoman provinces as though they were, just suburbs of Istanbul, whether it was in Syria or Iraq or Palestine or Israel, wherever the case may be. And so we extend a very special thanks to him for underscoring the relevance and timeliness of Soner's new book. We're very proud at the Washington Institute that we've had a Turkish research program going back many years now, a program that has focused attention on the uniquely important role that Turkey plays in the arena that we focus on here at the Institute, but also more broadly in American foreign policy and in the overall relationship between Europe, the Middle East, Asia, the Mediterranean, the truly pivotal role that Turkey plays. And we are extremely fortunate to have for years now as our Bayer Family Fellow and Director of our Turkish research program, Dr. Soner Cagaptay. As I said earlier, this is the third of Soner's books over the last decade that has focused on the evolution of Erdogan's leadership inside Turkey, an absolutely fascinating development of a country, of a leader, of a society that has had enormous achievements and I think it's fair to say terrible and scary moments, and certainly a complicating factor in how America tries to advance its interests in the various regions. I think there's no one that our government has been able to turn to with as much consistency and insight to help explain what motivates Erdogan and provides insight into the evolution of Turkish foreign policy as Soner. And on behalf of the Institute, I'm really delighted to congratulate you on this achievement. So Soner, congratulations.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it.
To share in this congratulations today, we have a fascinating panel that will delve into the policy angles of what Soner is bringing out in Erdogan's empire. First, after Soner makes some opening remarks, I'm going to turn the podium over to Thomas Huskins, Soner's publisher, the commissioning editor for politics at IB Tauris, an imprint of Bloomsbury Publishing, to make a few remarks. Delighted that you're here with us today. And then after Thomas speaks, we're going to turn to Amanda. I'm sorry, my glasses on. We're going to turn to Amanda Sloat. Amanda is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. She served in the U.S. government for nearly a decade, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean Affairs at the State Department. And I'm very delighted Amanda is here today. And then we'll turn to Molly Montgomery. Molly is Vice President in Albright Stonebridge Group's Europe practice. She served previously in the State Department as also a special advisor to Vice President Pence for Europe and Eurasia, and as Deputy Director at the Office of Eastern European Affairs. Amanda and Molly, of course, bring deep government experience to bear, looking at the often confounding issues surrounding Turkey and U.S.-Turkish relations. And then, after everyone has had their say, we'll pull back this podium, and then everyone will be able to lob their questions at our panelists. And I'm quite sure that by the time our hours have concluded, you will all be eagerly rushing out to the foyer to pick up your own copy of Erdogan's Empire. And just for our live streaming audience, this is why Amazon exists, to order your version of Erdogan's Empire. With that, I'll turn the floor over to my friend and colleague, Soner Cagaptay. Soner. Please give Soner a round of applause for this fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Rob, for your words of support. I also wanted to thank both Tomasz for flying all the way across the pond to be present at today's launch of my new book, Erdogan's Empire, Turkey and the Politics of the Middle East, as well as my friends and colleagues, Amanda Sloat and Molly Montgomery, for being present here. Really look forward to a great conversation and thought-provoking debate with them. I also want to thank everybody in the room. I'm seeing a lot of familiar and friendly faces, including former research assistants and interns and friends from the State Department, including some of my students at the Foreign Service Institute. It's really, I feel blessed to be surrounded by such a great company of friends and colleagues today. And thanks to, of course, everybody for joining us online for this conversation on what this new book means in the context of Turkey's foreign policy, for U.S. foreign policy, and for Turkey's neighbors, countries near and far, as near as far as Europe. Rob has mentioned I've been at the Institute tracking Turkish leader Erdogan's political career. In fact, the Institute hired me in the fall of 2002. They hired me out of high school to follow the trajectory of Mr. Erdogan. He got elected to become Turkey's prime minister only a few months after I joined the Institute staff as director of the Turkish Research Program. Since I've written 4 books on Erdogan, the last 3 form a trilogy, and with this book I'm completing this trilogy. The first book in this trilogy was my first book in the trilogy called The Rise of Turkey, published in 2015. This was an economic success story that I wanted to tell, of course, really a positive one. Erdogan delivered phenomenal economic growth after he became Turkey's prime minister in 2003, lifted many people out of poverty. And I want to tell the story, and I did, and I ended Rise of Turkey saying, Prime Minister at that time, Erdogan, you've done a great job. You have converted Turkey from a low-income country to a middle-income country. The factoid I like most from Rise of Turkey is that when Erdogan came to power, infant mortality rate in Turkey was comparable to pre-war Syria. That is pre-war Syria. Now it is comparable to Spain. So Turks used to look like Syrians. They look like the Spanish now, and that's why Erdogan wins. And then I ended the Rise of Turkey saying, it's now time for you to match the economic transformation with political reforms, write a liberal democratic constitution to provide for broad liberties for Turkey's citizens in the context of broadened individual rights, including Kurds. That's a great way for Turkey to address its Kurdish problem, as well as write a new constitution to end, finally, to put an end to Turkey's perennial problem between, for the lack of a better word, its 2 halves, the secular half and the pious half. And in that conclusion, I said that requires a constitution that provides for freedom of religion for the pious half and freedom from religion for the secular half. I don't think Erdogan read my book, so I wrote the next one called The New Sultan, which is not a positive story necessarily. It is a story of Turkey's domestic crisis that is delivered to a large part as a result of Mr. Erdogan's political trajectory. That was published 2 years ago. And now Erdogan's Empire is the foreign policy piece of this trilogy after looking at political economy, domestic politics. It's a re-evaluation of Turkish foreign policy, or rather Mr. Erdogan's foreign policy within the context of historical patterns of Turkish and Ottoman foreign policy. As I said earlier, I see a number of people, former staff members in the room who helped me with this book. I'm especially grateful to my research assistant, Egecan, who's sitting over there. Thank you, Egecan. Egecan helped me draft this book, finish it for submission. I don't think he signed up on that when he was my RA, but we did a great job together. Deniz, my other research assistant in the room, who helped me finish this book, as well as Çağatay in the room, and I'm seeing Yaz and other research assistants and staff members who have tremendously helped me with the book. I apologize if I'm missing anybody. I also wanted to thank a large number of friends in Turkish government, US government, and European governments who have reviewed various versions of this book and helped me improve it. Colleagues in the field of international studies and Middle East and European studies, and scholars who have provided valuable feedback. Many of them are acknowledged in the book. Some have wanted to stay anonymous. But my thanks go to everybody who's helped me with the book. And finally, I wanted to tell you that I've dedicated this book, Erdogan's Empire, in loving memory of my father, who I spent very little time with. He died when I was very little. He also worked night shifts at a factory. I saw him only when he came home in the mornings. He has a special role in the way that I have committed my career to the study of international relations, in no small part because in the very small time that I saw my father every morning when he came from the factory and before I headed to school, at the age of 5, I learned to read because my job was to read him news about the Cyprus War and discuss it with him. Now you know how old I am. Of course, his memory is special to me, and I wanted to dedicate this book to his memory. What I have done in Erdogan's Empire is, as an historian of modern Turkey and Ottoman Empire, I've tried to put Erdogan's foreign policy in the context of historical patterns of Turkish and Ottoman foreign policy. And I've done this also taking into account what I call historical antibodies, how Turks see their neighbors and how Turkey's neighbors see Turks, and how this interaction has shaped, facilitated, or hindered Erdogan's foreign policy achievements and engagements. In doing this, of course, I think the Ottoman piece of this explanation is important because I believe that nations that were great powers once, such as Turkey, Russia, China, have an inflated sense of their heyday and a malleable sense of their heyday, in the sense that this comes with a readiness to be inspired and sometimes a vulnerability to be exploited by effective politicians who embody this narrative and speak to it. I also think that understanding the importance of the Turks' imperial past is important to understanding modern Turkey, because a romantic view of the collapsed Ottoman Empire continues to shape the views held by Turkey's citizens of the place of their country in the world. And that takes us, of course, to the main actor of Erdogan's empire, Mr. Erdogan himself. He is the most consequential Turkish politician of the 21st century, if not since Ataturk, for the last 100 years at least, since Ataturk established modern Turkey out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire in 1923. Since coming to power, as I've highlighted and described in length in the new Sultan, Erdogan has, for the most part, transformed Turkey's domestic political environment. Or maybe I should say he continues to transform it because he faces a significant and formidable opposition, as we saw recently with the loss of Istanbul and other cities' mayoral positions to the opposition. So this is work in progress for Erdogan, but he's trying and continuing with his efforts to shape Turkey in his own image. Happy to look at that in the Q&A, but for the sake of this conversation, I think what's important is to look at the changes he's introduced to Turkey's foreign policy as the country's most consequential leader in nearly a century. I think Erdogan has recalibrated Turkey's foreign policy, and in this regard, he has introduced new elements. But I would say overall, his foreign policy represents both continuity and change when compared with past policy, Turkey's foreign policy before Erdogan, meaning foreign policy patterns under Turkey's presidents and in the 20th century and sultans in the 19th century. In the Ottoman westernization that started in the early 19th century, we often think of it as a cultural project of westernization, adopting Western institutions and values. That is true, but I also think that Turkish westernization is at least in part also a strategic project. It was driven by an ambition to copy Western states, European powers, global powers of the early 19th century, in order to revive Ottoman greatness. So it was about bringing cultural institutions, but it was more importantly about copying European statecraft in order to revive Turkey as a great Ottoman Empire, as a great power in the mold of great powers of the time. That came with a policy, ready-made policy, that because the sultans recognized the weakness of the Ottoman Empire with the rise of the Eastern Question in the 1830s, it came with a readiness to make informal and then formal alliances with Western powers and European nations to protect the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and modern Turkey in the 20th century while waiting for Turkey's greatness to return. And this has been the broader pattern throughout 200 years before the rise of Erdogan. Throughout the 19th century, Ottoman sultans made informal alliances with the British, who protected the integrity of the Ottoman state for the most part, because they did not want the Russians to take advantage of Ottoman weakness and capture the Bosphorus and access the warm seas through Istanbul. And at the same time, this was an informal alliance, meaning this was never developed into a treaty, of course. But throughout the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, named the sick man of Europe by the early 19th century, managed to claw its way to the 20th century, primarily because of this policy of making sure that it had Western friends against Russia. Fast forward, Ataturk establishes Turkey out of the ashes of Ottoman Empire. After his restoration in the 1930s, he pivots to France and UK, joining mostly France-backed pacts in southeastern Europe as a way to protect Turkey against Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. World War II ends. Turkey's leaders followed Ataturk, known as Kemalists, followed a similar policy when Stalin demanded territory in 1946, taking Turkey to become friends with the United States this time. The pattern continues, making friends with a Western Bloc ally or nation. And this time it became formalized with Turkey's accession to NATO in 1952. So broadly speaking, this has been a 200-year policy nearly from 1830s up to the early 21st century, where Turkey's leaders have strived to revive Turkey as a great nation, but at the same time have also made alliances with Western powers while waiting for that great power status to return. Erdogan is not an unusual Turkish leader. He's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to revive Turkey's greatness, in my view. He's therefore not unusual when compared to Ataturk, Turkey's 20th century presidents, or 19th century sultans. Where he is different is that he has picked an unorthodox model in the context of historical patterns of Turkish and Ottoman foreign policy. He has no patience for Turkey's greatness to return. He wants it to happen on his own clock. And he's also not interested in simply folding Turkey under a Western ally while waiting for Turkey's greatness to return. He wants this to happen while Turkey acts as a standalone power. That's where I think he is unorthodox. And New Sultan evaluates not only these patterns, and I don't want to tell you everything because I want you to buy the book, but also looks at how Erdogan's policy evolved. It wasn't, of course, always consistent with the theme that I just laid out. I actually see three periods during which Erdogan's foreign policy changed or went through transformations. The first is pretty much throughout the last decade, the entire last decade. Erdogan at that time felt boxed in by Turkey's secular constitution, secularist military, and traditional pro-Western orientation. So he tried to be a better version of the late Kemalist foreign policy makers, more internationalist, more pro-U.S. after having a rupture with the U.S. Iraq War, supporting America in Iraq, more pro-Europeanist, embracing EU accession, tried to unify Cyprus, normalize ties with Armenia. So definitely a much better version of the late Kemalist foreign policy makers of the 1990s. But that period came to an end, as I write in Erdogan's Empire, towards the end of the last decade. Between 2008 and 11, Erdogan took over reins of power in Turkey. He passed an amendment in 2010 that allowed him to appoint judges to the high courts without a confirmation process. He, with help from his then ally Gülen movement, he defanged the secularist Turkish military through the Ergenekon case. Happy to debate this and articulate on it in the Q&A. But as well as starting a process of locking up dissidents and opponents. In my view, democracy in Turkey came under attack not necessarily after the failed coup of 2016, a nefarious affair, but during the Ergenekon trials when opposing Erdogan through ideas became a crime, in no small part with assistance from the Gülen movement. That was a period that saw Turkey's institutions fall under Erdogan and felt no more boxed by these traditional limitations. Starting at around 2011, Erdogan launched a new set of foreign policy initiatives aimed at reviving Ottoman power and regional powerdom for Turkey. The beginning of the Arab uprisings at first seemed to help Erdogan in this regard, with help from his foreign minister turned prime minister Davutoglu. Erdogan launched a number of initiatives. And in all these initiatives, Turkey ended up supporting just one actor in the Arab uprisings, that's the Muslim Brotherhood. For a while, it looked as if Turkey was doing well as the Brotherhood came to power in Egypt and looked on the precipice of coming to power elsewhere. But the Brotherhood's quick ouster from power in Egypt left Turkey isolated in the region, and Turkey's continued support to the Brotherhood then isolated the country against Arab majority neighbors and countries in the Middle East, from Egypt to UAE to Saudis. Relations with a number of countries collapsed or went on hibernation. But the worst outcome for the second phase of Erdogan's foreign policy, in my view, was Turkish engagement in the war in Syria. You see, Turkey has a dozen neighbors. I'll go through the list so you can create your own mental map, and then I'll ask you a question. So the list, of course, going clockwise: Cyprus, Greece, Bulgaria, all in the EU, north of the Black Sea, which is a limited access sea in the sense that its waters are nearly partitioned between its littoral states, adding three more neighbors: Romania, Ukraine, and Russia. Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Of that dozen neighbors, there are only two that Turkish foreign policymakers really pay attention to and are worried about, and they would be Iran and Russia. That's because the role of historical antibodies. As an historian of Ottoman Empire, when I was framing Turkey's ties to its dozen neighbors, I realized a pattern. Turkey feels comfortable and not worried to push against a large number of its neighbors, interfering in their domestic affairs in Iraq, engaging in the war in Syria, but not necessarily when it comes to Iran and Russia. It tries to stay away from them and not necessarily confront them. That is because while for the duration of the Ottoman Empire, half a millennium, the Turks ruled over and defeated conclusively the other 10 neighbors: Romanians, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Greeks, Cypriots, Kurds, Arabs, Armenians, Georgians, Azerbaijanis. That was not the case in Turkey's relationship with Russia and Iran. The opposite was the case with Russia. Russia defeated and conclusively did so the Ottoman Empire, by my count, over a range of wars, totaling up to a dozen and a half. Guess who started all these wars? The Russians. Guess who lost all of them overall? The Turks. So a perception, therefore, exists in Turkey that Russia is the one neighbor Turkey ought to be scared of. Iran's relationship with Turkey is not quite similar. Iranians never conclusively defeated the Turks, but then the Turks never conclusively defeated the Iranians either. So it's more of a power parity that was established following nearly 200 years of debilitating wars that ended in the 17th century. So Turkey and Iran are in a power parity. Why did I tell you all of this? Because Turkish engagement in Russia to oust Assad regime has put Turkey against its two historic adversaries, meaning its nemesis Russia and its competitor Iran. Turkey is very, of course, exposed to threats against these countries. So realizing this, I think in 2016, Erdogan entered the third phase of his foreign policy. After firing Davutoglu and using this as an excuse, he reset ties with Iraq. He reset ties with Israel. He had decoupled Turkey from Israel in 2010. And he also started entering into ad hoc deals with Russia in Syria. And this is also a time when U.S.-Turkish relations started to zigzag. Happy to look into that further in the Q&A. But the overall picture I think I should give to you before I turn the floor to Tomasz and Malyan and Amanda is I can tell you more of this analysis, or I'd rather give you the opening scene of one of the chapters in my book. This is the chapter where I look at Erdogan's swearing-in ceremony when he became Turkey's new executive-style president on July 9, 2018. So in 2017, he passed a referendum that significantly increases powers. Turkey switched from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential system. Erdogan, therefore, is now head of state, head of government, head of ruling party, head of the police, which is a national force, and head of the military, because he's chief of staff and commander. Therefore, the swearing-in ceremony in 2018 was when all these powers fully kicked in. For all practical purposes, he became the first sultan of Turkey's Second Republic. Who was present at his swearing-in ceremony? A large number of leaders, monarchs, presidents were invited to the ceremony. 22 countries were represented. There was not a single EU or NATO member state who was represented at head of state level. The only exception was Bulgaria. Happy to look at the special relationship there. Except for Bulgaria, none of the EU or NATO member countries were there. There was also, ironically for Erdogan's efforts to make Turkey a great nation in the Middle East, standalone power, not a single Middle Eastern monarch or president present except for the Emir of Qatar. So Turkey is completely isolated in the region, from Syria and Iraq down to Egypt and across the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. You might wonder, since we often hear about Turkey and Russia becoming allies in quotes, what was who was present from Moscow, Russia, or China or Iran? Not a single head of state from Russia, China, or Iran. So clearly, this was not replacing one set of relationships with another in the Middle East, or an alternative Russia, China, or Iran. Quite ironically, at the height of his political career, on this hot day in Ankara, when temperature hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Erdogan was not greeted by any of Turkey's traditional Western allies, nor was he congratulated by any of his newfound friends in capitals such as Moscow and Tehran, or any of the friends from the Middle East, except for the Emir of Qatar, who was present. Heads of state of East and West African states. And I give credit to Erdogan in the book that this is where Erdogan's empire does stretch. Turkey has invested in these countries, built in heavily, promoted humanitarian aid, built diplomatic missions. Turkish Airlines started flying to these destinations. Turkey has made a sincere effort to build influence in East and West African nations, and nearly a dozen of them were represented, from Somalia and Sudan up across the Sahara to Senegal and Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea were present at the ceremony, represented by their heads of state. Heads of state of Western Balkan states were there, Bosnia and Kosovo and a few others. Heads of state from Central Asia and Caucasus were there. The second part of Erdogan's empire, I argue in my book, is what I call the Bayram belt. Bayram is a Turkish word for a Muslim high holiday, known to Arabs as Eid. I argue that because of historical, cultural, and linguistic affinities, it has been easier for Erdogan to build influence in Eurasia than in the Middle East. That would be called the Eid belt, using the Arabic word for the high holiday. But he has actually been quite successful, as demonstrated by the leaders who were present at his swearing-in ceremony, in building influence in Eurasia to Turkey's north, countries where the Muslim high holiday is known as Bayram. So clearly, not everything is necessarily negative. As I try to be balanced and fair in my assessment of Mr. Erdogan's foreign policy, but it doesn't necessarily leave Turkey at an optimistic point. Turkey is today not able to rely on its traditional allies, and it has no friends in the Middle East except for Qatar, and it's exposed to its nemesis, Russia in Syria, and its competitor, Iran in Syria. So that leaves it quite vulnerable. I lay out three scenarios, and I hope that my friends will join in to discuss, especially the scenario part of this conversation, but others as well, for Turkey going forward. The first is more of the same. Of today, muddling through, Turkey continues to leverage its ties with the U.S. Against its ties with Russia to get the most that it wants in Syria. Basically, it's a standalone actor that negotiates with all sides, not having any real true friends except for this 20 countries or so that I went through in the list. That's the first scenario. It's the most realistic, but it's also not an exclusive one. The second scenario I see is where Turkey is folding, or rather is forced to fold under one of these blocks that it's grinding against. The West, that's Europe, US. The North, that's Russia. The East, that's Iran. And the South, it's Arab neighbors. And don't want to see this happen, but Turkey's economy, which is fragile, of course, is the main reason Erdogan has been able to spread Turkey's wings. Turkey is often touted and praised the soft power. Economic growth has been driving this, and economy has slowed down, entering a recession formally. So that limits Turkey's ability to leverage these blocks against each other. It also provides countries with leverage over Turkey, such as Russia, in terms of economic assistance or the ability to bully Turkey, as Russia has done in the past. And I don't see any reason why Russia would not do it if Turkey was completely vulnerable. And the third scenario is perhaps wishful thinking, perhaps realistic, happy to debate it, is what I call a relinking with the strategic West. So I think we could argue back and forth, but it's clear to me at least that Mr. Erdogan doesn't see Turkey as part of cultural or political West. But he does see that Turkey relies as a resource poor and energy a country that also needs to import its energy, $30 billion in oil and gas wells every year. Turkey needs investment, much of which comes from Europe, to grow. And remember, it is economic growth, which means Erdogan has lifted many people out of poverty, that has helped him win elections. There can be many explanations as to why he lost Istanbul recently. I think the key one is the economy. This was the first time the economy stumbled, and the first time Erdogan stumbled at the ballot box. So if Erdogan knows this, I think it's very clear that despite his efforts to recalibrate Turkey's ties with the West, the strategic West, which I define as collective membership of NATO and OECD, still dominates in Turkey's trade and investment patterns. In fact, the share of strategic West in Turkish investment has increased, or investment in Turkey rather, has increased between 2002 and 2019, although Erdogan tried to recalibrate that. And Europe still dominates in Turkey's trades. Turkey still relies on the West for security, on NATO. So maybe this is, of course, wishful thinking, but hopefully this is where it heads. I will stop here. I just wanted to give you a sense of what Erdogan's empire is about. I also wanted to show you a copy of the book because I like it. And hopefully we'll come back to some of these themes. I'm sure there are things that I left out. This is one of the longest works I've written. I'm supposed to take a break. I promised to Rob. No more books on Erdogan, but on Turkey, yes. So I can still squeeze it in. But hopefully I didn't miss out anything, but if there is anything, feel free to come back, ask about it. I know there's a lot to discuss, and I look forward to chatting and having a long conversation with all of you in this room and outside about this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. Very good. Come on.
Sorry.
Thank you all for coming today. Definitely one of the most informed audiences at any book launch that I can remember for our books. I'm a little nervous standing up here, not as a subject expert, but as a publisher. It's an honor to celebrate Sona's book, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing from the illustrious panel of expertise that we have here and also in this room. I'm somebody who's worked on 2 books with Sona, and this is the 3rd of his trilogy, as we've heard. I think together it's really the complete trilogy on modern Turkey, and I think all 3 of the books will really stand for many, many years to come as the greatest collection of clear thinking, clear-sighted thinking on Turkey. And I think they'll have a great influence, actually. Reading and editing these books has been an education for me, and I feel then like I have something in common with his readership, which is that I've had an education in Erdogan, who he is, where he comes from in his world. And that's something that, when we started on these books, was really missing. A lot of people, policymakers, journalists, academics, couldn't really tell you who Erdogan was, where he came from, how he thought. Now, it seems obvious what kind of a leader Erdogan is, but Sona, you were one of the first, I think, to really sketch that out for a Western audience, that 10 years ago saw him as a truly progressive, modernizing president, and now I think we have a slightly different, more nuanced view. Our mission at IB Tourist, much like the Washington Institute here, is to inform readers and also help shape policy. I spend a lot of my time trying to persuade academics and researchers to talk to an audience that goes beyond other academics and researchers. And that's something that I think we've done successfully with these books. One of the lessons I take from this book and all of Sona's work is you can't know where things are going unless you know where they come from. I think the history in this book is really, really strong. I have a quotation on my desk from Virgil, "Blessed is he who understands the causes of things." And I feel like that's the role of a publisher, and that's the role of the work that's done here at the Institute as well. So Turkey's relations with the West and the East, I just think it's the crucial story for understanding the Middle East. I really do still think that. Sona has a great line in this book where he says, from the East, Turkey looks like a Western country, and from the West, Turkey looks like an Eastern country. And I think that's a fundamental which will never change, and that's why Turkey has continued to fascinate people for the last 1,000 years and probably for the next 1,000 years. Erdogan now appears to me to be, and publishers, we have a strange sort of bird's eye view of the world because I work on books from all around the globe, and then you start seeing these odd similarities popping up. Erdogan now starts to look like one of these macho strongmen leaders that we've got everywhere, whether it's Netanyahu or Viktor Orban in Hungary, Donald Trump here in the US, if I may. Interesting to hear about ex-imperial countries having an inflated view of their past. As a British person, I can definitely relate to that. And I think a lot of the answers for Brexit definitely come from that sort of mentality. And it's interesting to think about whether Turkey has a similar issue with its past. How these leaders, these sort of what seem to be sort of macho leaders, interact with each other, it is going to shape all of our lives and the political future in the short to medium term anyway. I'm pleased to have played a small part in illuminating just one of these leaders, Erdogan. And I wouldn't be a publisher, and I think I'm actually contractually obliged to say you must buy the book, because you'll only hear here a small slice of what's contained, and also his other books too. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Many thanks indeed for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank you very much to Rob for the invitation to join this event today, and congratulations to Sonair on yet another book. I told him it only seems like a few months ago that I was sitting in the audience celebrating his last book launch. So as someone who is now trying to write, impressive the speed at which you are able to produce books. I have been focusing on Brexit for the last couple of months, so it's also nice to have the opportunity to come back and engage on Turkish politics, which I think in some ways are in a similar place to where they were when I left them. I served in the State Department responsible for U.S.-Turkey relations from 2013 to 2016. So I started soon after the Gezi protests, and I left about 6 weeks before the coup. So it was an interesting period in bilateral relations, and certainly benefited a lot during that time from Sonair's expertise. I was struck by one of the lines in his book that perceptions of Turkey in the last number of years have shifted from a European country to a Middle East country. And certainly sitting in the State Department, Turkey forms a very challenging bureaucratic seam. It falls within the European Bureau at the State Department, but certainly lots of our conversations were focused on what it was doing in the Middle East. Within the Pentagon, it's within the EUCOM space, but there's a lot of CENTCOM operations that are run out of there. It's within the European Bureau at the National Security Council, but there are also, again, a lot of Middle East nexus there. And after many years of fighting to keep Turkey within the European space, I think those of us in that camp at times might have been happy to let our colleagues in the Middle East Bureau take on the challenge for a while. But certainly I think it's an important seam that Turkey is going to continue to sit at the middle of. When I look at where we are and the future of relations, to me, the easiest way to characterize this is that we now have a bilateral relationship that's characterized by a lot of mistrust and also a certain amount of misunderstanding. And there's certainly long-standing grievances that have accumulated between both sides. From the Turkish perspective, I think there's very real questions that Ankara is asking about whether or not the United States cares about its security. And Turkey would certainly point to the continued residence of Fethullah Gulen here in Pennsylvania and also American cooperation with the YPG in Syria. From the U.S., there are increasing questions about whether or not Turkey is a reliable partner. And they would look at democratic backsliding in the country, Turkish purchase of Russian S-400 missiles, and also Turkish reluctance, certainly initially, to get as actively involved in the counter-ISIS campaign as the United States would have liked them to. I was struck as Sonair was concluding and also by the conclusion of his book with the three possible scenarios that he's looking at, which I think can be boiled down to muddle through, to failure, and to relinking. And I think all of them are plausible, and I think there are likely elements from all three that we could see. In the near term, I think the muddle through is the most likely direction that we're going to go, and I also think it's the direction that we have been in for the last couple of years, including the period of time when I was in the State Department. If we look back a little bit further, I think there initially was great optimism about this relationship. When Erdogan came in, as Soner said, he was taking a lot of steps that were modernizing the economy, modernize the democracy, starting EU accession talks. If you think back to 2009, Turkey was the first country that President Obama visited on a bilateral basis after he became president. Famously gave a big speech in the Turkish parliament, talked about the potential for a model partnership. And so there was a lot of optimism. And similarly on the EU side with accession talks starting. So the question, I think, of whether we can get back to as strong of a linkage as we saw 10 years ago is going to be difficult. Certainly relations between Turkey and the US, Turkey and the EU deteriorated in the period after that. And I think in some ways, muddling through may end up being about the best that we're able to do right now. So let me just briefly look at a couple of the things I think that are contributing to some of this policy stasis and that I think are going to continue to be challenges in the near term. The first is this issue of Gulen, and certainly for a number of years, this was the number one talking point on the Turkish government's agenda. My sense is that has quieted down a little bit. It's still certainly a campaign on this from Erdogan, his remarks in Turkey, also press coverage of pro-Gulenist trailers, I think, driving around in New York this week. So that issue is going to continue and is going to remain as an irritant, but it seems a little less salient than it was in the immediate aftermath of the coup. Second, and one of the issues that I think is going to remain the most complicated is this whole question of Russian S-400s, the implications for the F-35s. We saw a long period over the last couple of months with lots of anticipation about U.S. imposition of CAATSA sanctions, Turkey being removed from the F-35 program, and what this was going to mean about Turkey's continued participation in Western security institutions, and also whether or not we saw a shift in Turkey's orientation from the West towards Russia. This all seems to have quieted down a little bit, and I think for those of us watching Turkey, and probably even more so for those of us watching Washington, it's trying to read the tea leaves and work out what that means. My own sense is that this issue is not done. This is something that Congress developed not as legislation to punish Turkey, but as legislation to punish Russia for interfering in our elections. And it's going to be something that Congress is going to continue to keep an eye on and want to ensure that the administration enforces. How the administration chooses to do that, at what time, and with what prompting from Congress, I think remains to be seen. But I don't think anybody should think that this issue is done. And to Soner's second scenario about potential failure, this is something I think that could potentially play up. Relatedly, and I think Exhibit A in the category of the U.S. and Turkey being able to muddle through, is the whole situation in Syria. As somebody who was serving in government at the time the U.S. started the cooperation with the YPG and the counter-ISIS campaign, it's actually amazed me that we've managed to kick the can down the road as long as we have in an issue that really has caused, I think, pretty significant tensions between two NATO allies. We've again reached another point of stasis where we have a Manbij roadmap that's being implemented. In the last couple of weeks, we've had the launch of joint patrols, the launch of a command center. So on the surface level, there is a degree of technical and military cooperation that is underway, but this still does not solve the long-term and fundamental difference of perspective between the United States and Turkey on the future of Syria, and particularly what this means for the Kurds, a potential Kurdish region, and U.S. security cooperation with the Kurds. So again, I think this falls into Soner's second category of potential failures as something that could end up flaring up, especially if you end up having Erdogan having a unilateral intervention into Syria. In the worst case scenario, if you had this result in the death of an American service member, this is something that could cause a significant rupture in bilateral relations, but for right now is being kept in a box. Third, there's the question of economics. I know a lot of people in the Turkish press were quite focused on Wilbur Ross's recent visit, pointing to the fact that he was there for 5 days, what this meant about the seriousness of his visit. I think if you look at the calendar, some of those 5 days were over a weekend, but there's been a lot of hype paid to that. And economics certainly has long been an underdeveloped component of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. And again, if you go back to the Obama time, following his visit to Turkey, a lot of effort was focused on ways to try and reinvigorate greater trade, greater economic development between the United States and Turkey. And that has not come to fruition, and we're talking about it again now. So yes, I think it's important. I think both sides recognize that it's important, but I think there also continue to be structural challenges that are making that difficult. And quite frankly, I think some of the democratic challenges that we're seeing in Turkey are going to be feeding into the minds of American investors about how heavily they want to get involved in the Turkish market at this point. Soner also said on the risk category, if you do have a significant tanking of the Turkish economy, that's going to end up playing in Turkish domestic politics, which, as we've seen, is quite closely linked to how Erdogan ends up playing in foreign policy. Final point is the issue of democracy and domestic politics. We've seen continued backsliding in Turkey on the democratic front. Some issues with rule of law in Turkey have contributed to tensions in bilateral relations with the United States, most visibly last year with the imprisonment of Pastor Andrew Brunson. We still have Turkish staff of American consulates who are imprisoned in Turkey. And so I think there is going to be continued concern in the United States about some of these democratic trends in Turkey. That said, I don't want to live in a glass house on this. There certainly are also challenges that we're facing here in the American political system. And quite frankly, it makes it a little bit harder for the United States to lecture Turkey and others about flaws in their own democracy when we're facing a lot of struggles here in our own country. And I think there's a lot of unpredictability in the American political system that could end up affecting the way U.S.-Turkish relations go forward. Right now, I think we've got 3 loci of power in Washington foreign policy making, which creates some confusion, I think, in Turkey and has the risk of miscalculations. First, we have the administration, the State Department, the Pentagon, the normal bureaucracy that I think has been quite focused on preserving relations. Second, we have Congress, and I think, as all of you as friends of Turkey in this room know, attitudes in Congress towards Turkey have gotten increasingly hostile and frustrated over the last number of years. And then finally, we have the president, and the president is not always in sync with the bureaucracy on these issues, which I think can sometimes make it difficult for Turkey to know what the U.S. position on this actually is. And I think there will be questions a year from now when we have elections in the U.S. to see who we end up with in the White House and what the complexion of Congress looks like in terms of how these continued attitudes toward Turkey play out. So I think in my own sense where I would come down on this is I do think muddling through is going to be the likely way forward for right now. I think there are a number of risk factors that could end up negatively impacting upon the relations. And I think there is a narrow but at this moment potentially less likely opportunity for significant relinking and a return to where things were 10 years ago in the relationship.
Thank you so much.
Amanda, thank you. Molly?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Rob, for the invitation to be here, and congratulations, Soner, for writing not one terrific book, but 3, and as Amanda said, in such quick succession that I really don't know how you do it. So if you want to give any of us lessons, please do. Well, I will try to keep my remarks brief, partly because Amanda stole all of my talking points, and partly because I'm the last person standing in the way of Q&A. But I want to start by just pulling out a couple of themes that I was really struck by in reading the book, and that I think are not as well understood in Washington and in Ankara as they should be, and are part of the reason why we have the level of mistrust that we do in the relationship and that Amanda explained so well. And the first is really, a point that Amanda just made, which is that Washington isn't a monolith. And I think often it's easy, particularly as power is consolidated in Ankara, to have the view that there's an intentionality that there's an intentionality to everything that is happening in Washington, and that power is really centralized in one man. And as Amanda put well, not only is that not the case in that we have 3 branches of government that have a real separation of powers, that at times I think has created issues in terms of understanding the way that the American government has behaved on issues like Gulen, but also that even within the bureaucracy itself that there are differences. And I really appreciated that Soner drew out the historical examples in particular of the way that the Department of Defense's attitudes toward Turkey have changed over time and some key incidents that shaped those views. And so pulling out the Iraq War, the flotilla, and the feeling that Kurds are brothers in arms who should be supported. And that has long contrasted with some of the other attitudes that you see within different parts of the bureaucracy. As Amanda said, the State Department generally wants to see positive relations with Turkey and is more sympathetic to the concerns that Turkey has about, for example, in Syria, cooperation with the YPG. And so that at times results in schisms within the U.S.'s own policy, implementation challenges, delays, and other things that often are taken as a lack of sincerity in the policy or as an attempt to roll it back, when in fact it's a result of our, at times, always complicated, at times difficult policymaking process. And so having a deeper understanding of not just the way the bureaucracy works, but of how our separation of powers comes into play, I think would be very helpful in moving forward. And I would just echo what Amanda said in terms of how attitudes on Capitol Hill and elsewhere have changed and hardened over the past few years. And so one of the things that we often see is that there is an even greater disconnect between the Hill and the administration, and not just this administration, than there is within different parts of the administration. And that really leads to, again, sort of a helter-skelter policy-making process that leaves us all asking questions, as Amanda said, about whether there will be sanctions under CATSA, whether there will be other actions taken independently by Congress or to force the administration's hand. So that's, I think, a lesson that could be learned, in Ankara, and that all of us in Washington can do a better job of transmitting to our Turkish friends and colleagues to try to improve an understanding of how this place works and how Turkey can successfully engage Washington. I think on Washington's part, what we often don't understand and what this book is really about is, where does Turkish foreign policy come from? What are the aspects of Turkish identity that play into that? And how has Turkish history shaped Erdogan's foreign policy perspective and outlook on Turkey's strategic interests more broadly? And so I think Soner did a great job of describing Turkish foreign policy and Erdogan's foreign policy in particular as both a reaction to Kemalism and also a reassertion of Turkey by conscious choice as a Muslim and Eastern power. And so understanding how Turkish history informs Erdogan's outlook and Erdogan's decision-making, I think, would result in very different attitudes toward Turkey, both in Washington and also in Brussels. Because once you understand that Erdogan is not trying to make Turkey, remake Turkey in the image of the West, it leads you to very different policy conclusions about the correct approach to Turkey. And once you understand that Erdogan is trying to chart a course that is independent, I think it helps to understand the complexity of that endeavor and where there are likely to be points of friction. So that's a plug for all of us, I think, to read the book very closely and to take some of those lessons to heart as we continue to engage. Soner laid out 3 scenarios for the future.
Two feet difference.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I would say that, like Amanda, I think probably the least likely scenario, or a scenario with a pretty slim chance, is relinking with the strategic West. I think it pains a lot of us to say that, but as Amanda laid out very well, many, if not all, of sort of the key components of the friction that has developed and worsened over the last few years between the West and Turkey remain. And so until you remove those obstacles, it's very difficult to see there being any sort of real, genuine forward progress, where Erdogan in particular would want to attach himself again to the West. You have all of these issues with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law that emerged post-coup attempt. And while Erdogan is in power, those are unlikely to be resolvable. And on Erdogan's side, you have as well Gulen, the YPG, and of course the S-400s. So until and unless we see, I think, a real step change in terms of these issues, we're unlikely to see both sides kiss and make up. So where does that leave us? I would agree with both Soner and Amanda that muddling through is the most likely scenario, but it's becoming more and more difficult. So I think we all agree that we're in an era of renewed strategic or great power competition. And so that means that standing with one foot in an increasing number of camps is becoming more and more difficult over time. And so I would maybe call the muddling through scenario more of a balancing act. And if that balancing act, if Erdogan fails in that balancing act, I think the consequences are great, and that's when we could see Turkey moving to the third scenario in terms of being forced to fold under one of these blocks. There are a few things that make it difficult for Erdogan to balance. So one is that he's balancing personalities. You have Trump, Putin, and Erdogan, who in many ways are mirror images of each other. They're all thin-skinned. They all have a tendency at times to overplay their hands. And so what that means is that disagreements that could be managed by diplomacy in other cases, when you have a combination of two of these leaders, can very quickly escalate or spiral out of control. You also have the need to balance an economy that is still extremely precarious. And while, as Amanda noted, there are signs that investment may be increasing and that Turkey looks like a good value, as the IMF pointed out yesterday, there's still a lot of fragility in the economy. And there are a lot of questions about the independence of Turkish economic policymakers and how they will move forward. And we all know that growth has been key to Erdogan's success. Growth will be key to Erdogan's ability to continue this balancing act. And so there may be increasing pressures between the domestic, the economic, and the foreign policy, and how he balances those will also be key. So I don't want to make any predictions, but I do think that muddling through is going to become more and more difficult, and it will cause Erdogan to have to walk that tightrope ever more carefully as time goes on. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Very good. Thank you to all of you for your remarks and for your prophecies about which one of Soner's scenarios is likely to take hold. So, Soner, I want to open up a conversation and ask you, I guess, about a core question which emerges from the fact that this is a book about a singular leader's foreign policy put into the context of centuries of Turkish and Ottoman history. So to me, as a historian, it's the obvious question, which is how much of this, the creation of Erdogan's empire, is now bigger than Erdogan? How deeply entrenched are these ideas now in the Turkish national psyche? Is this the new normal of how the Turkish political elite sees itself and Turkey, or does this wither on the vine with the passing of Erdogan?
Thank you, Rob. And I also wanted to thank Tomasz, Amanda, and Molly for commenting on my book and providing feedback, and also hopefully provoking more questions from the audience. And this is also really useful for me because I'm someone who's unlearned Turkey and learned it from outside again. Part of my job is to explain Turkey for international audiences. And one of my goals, of course, in the new, both in this trilogy, covering Turkey's political economy, domestic politics, and foreign policy, was to explain Turkey for broader audiences, but also providing sometimes insight for what trends in Turkey mean for the outside world. I think Erdogan is the inventor of 21st century populism globally. That's why it was really difficult for me to find the right vocabulary to explain Erdogan in the last decade, because what happened in Turkey was seen as unique. Bon pour l'Orient, people said, never was good in Turkey, democracy, so it never should be. And now, though, you're seeing some of these trends that he initiated are actually global trends that transcend Turkey's boundaries. And one of these trends I think Erdogan launched, and that has come to maturity under his term. He's ruled Turkey for nearly 2 decades. At this time in history, Erdogan has ruled Turkey longer than did Ataturk. And remember, Ataturk's nearly decade and a half in government helped him shape Turkey after his own image. Erdogan has already ruled Turkey for nearly 17 years, and therefore his ability to shape Turkey's own image is quite significant. So part of that is the shift of Turkey's identity. To go to Rob's question, when I took over my job here at the Institute nearly 2 decades ago, I would go to these conversations such as these or others and lecture and train diplomats at the State Department and go around the country to lecture. And there was consensus in all the debates I attended, though some people debated it. Turkey had some kind of a European identity. Now the opposite consensus exists, that Turkey has a Middle Eastern identity, and I think Erdogan has changed that. So he has refashioned Turkey's identity, not just as it's seen by outsiders, but also by Turkey's citizens. Many have embraced this. Now, there might be some resentment over the failures of Syria policy, the burdens of which are multiple, from security threats to terror attacks, both PKK and ISIS related, to large number of refugees, to Turkey's isolation in the Middle East. And there might be some refashioning internally of Turkey's identity away from this Middle Eastern layer that Erdogan has been able to paint over or cast over Turkish society. But I also think this is, I know those of us who are watching us from Turkey are now saying, oh God, Turkey is now no more a European country, forget it. Identities are fluid and malleable. Countries' identities change again. Turkey's identity was, together with Greece, West European during the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, Greece became Southern Europe, Turkey became Middle Eastern. The Czech Republic was Eastern European, now it's Central European. Finland was considered an East European country in the interwar period, now it's Nordic. The King of Morocco is supposedly trying to cast Morocco as an Atlantic country. Examples are multiple. So this is not necessarily a final stamp. But to go to your question, I think even if Turkey relinks under the third path that I highlight in my book, relinks with the strategic West, it doesn't mean that we are going to get the old Turkish-Western relationship. That's not coming back, at least not for a while. And I wanted to elaborate on this. Strategic West is a term I kind of coined as I was finishing the manuscript, because I realized that despite Erdogan's efforts to recalibrate Turkey's ties to Europe and U.S., Turkey remains connected to Europe and U.S., not in the ways that necessarily suggest strong political ties, but ways that suggest strong financial and strategic ties. So Erdogan knows, despite all his ad hoc deals with Russia, that if Turkey's NATO membership is in danger, Turkey will be forced to fold under Russia. So NATO membership is valuable to him and dear. He also knows that although he has usually cast Europe and U.S. as Turkey's other, he needs U.S. and Europe to win elections, because that's still the source of majority of foreign direct investment that comes into Turkey. And the EU is still Turkey's dominant, if not majority, trading partner. So that is, I think, where the changes Erdogan has brought in to reshift Turkey's foreign policy are probably, for the time being, permanent. But as I said earlier, I don't think identities are permanent in international politics. Change, and we could see Turkey's identity swing back to some sort of an post-Erdogan identity, or one that embraces Europe differently. And in this regard, I think you're seeing some promising signs in the opposition, as we saw in the race for Istanbul's mayor. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but one of the takeaways of Erdogan's empire for me was, as I was unlearning Turkey and explaining from outside again, I was born and raised in Istanbul, so I had to kind of bring it to the audiences from an outside perspective. One of the takeaways of Erdogan's empire is realizing yet again, and that's one reason I love studying Turkey and writing about it, the complexity of this country. I think if countries could be vegetables, Turkey would be an onion. It's always a peel, never a core. Just when you think you got to the core, it's not there. You keep peeling. So, it's often easy to write Turkey off and say, oh, it's like Russia. Putin is in charge. Erdogan is in charge. Democracy is over. Yes, Erdogan, I think, has a political man crush on Putin. He likes Putin's style of governance. He probably wants to get to Putin in terms of having complete control over civil society. And I heard that after the last elections, in the general elections, Putin called Erdogan to congratulate. And I joked with a friend. I said, I don't think he congratulated. He said, how do you lose elections? Because that doesn't happen in Russia. What happened in Istanbul? So what does that tell us about Turkey? This onion-like country, if countries would be vegetables, that even if it's like Russia, the constituencies in Turkey that do not vote for Erdogan, demographically and economically, constitute a bloc that is nearly the size of Spain. So I would say it's like Russia with Spain in it. And that kind of requires a nuanced policy of approaching both and dealing with both, but also not forgetting that even this changed environments, Turkey remains completely hard to capture with just one adjective and say, yes, it's a Middle Eastern country. It will always be all these things at the same time. And I think taking into account the sheer size of the economic and demographic size of the bloc that opposes him, which is why he lost Istanbul, I would say, even if it's like Russia, of course, make sure that you don't ignore the Spain inside that's still there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I love that phrase, for the time being, permanent.
Thank you.
Do you care to add anything to this question? Either of you? Okay, let's turn the floor over to your questions, and please do identify to whom you're asking a question. Yes, please. There's a mic up in front.
Gentleman, a retired State Department officer who learned most of what he knows about Turkey from Dr. Cagaptay, in fact. I was struck by the fact that over the past hour or so, there was a complete absence of one key word, Islam, in all of this, considering that Erdogan, of course, is a representative, leader of an Islamic party. And during the Cold War, as I recall, much of the debate for decades about the Soviet Union was the degree to which its foreign policy was a nationalist one which could be traced back to the 19th century Russian Empire and precedents, very much like what you described for Turkey, and how much of it was based on a new ideology. And I wonder if you could address to what degree you believe Turkey's policy now is in any way driven by an Islamic ideology. And if so, to what extent, what is this ideology, or is it merely, if it does exist, a series of emotional impulses about who to like and who to dislike?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Really good to see you here. I'll take it on to discuss, elaborate rather, in further detail, as I describe it, the second part of Erdogan's foreign policy, in which I think Islam played a significant role, political Islam, that is. So Erdogan, at the beginning of the Arab uprisings, after he had boxed the military in, defanged it, and taken over reins of power in Turkey, seemed free to embrace pretty much any foreign policy that he liked, not feeling confined as he had done in the last decade by Turkey's institutions, existing foreign policy culture that he mostly pushed away and pushed aside between the period of 2008 and 2011 with significant help from the Gulen movement. 2011, therefore, in my view, is the beginning of the second phase. He's free to soar, just won new elections with nearly half of the electorate's support, able to appoint judges to the High Court without a confirmation process. So clearly in charge. The Arab uprising presented him with an opportunity to embrace or launch initiatives after his idea that Turkey should not wait for its greatness to return, but this should happen under Erdogan's clock, and it should do so as a standalone power. And then what he did, I think, was number one, it squandered Turkey's hard-earned soft power it had achieved in the last decade thanks to phenomenal economic growth. For the first time, Turkey's companies and products became completely sought after, not just in its Middle Eastern neighborhood, but broadly beyond. And Erdogan's support, in my view, to only Muslim Brotherhood-related parties was probably the biggest, strategic mistake in the during the second phase of his foreign policy. I would say Erdogan and Davutoglu, who helped him in this phase, as better policymakers, should have known that the Arab uprising and the opportunities it presented was similar to a horse race where there were many horses running, and you don't put all your money on one horse, and he put all his money on the Brotherhood. So if the Brotherhood had won, he would have won big in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, and elsewhere, but the Brotherhood lost, and he lost everything. And I think one could argue and say, well, did he not see that this was the end, and why did he not pivot? Why has he not pivoted, rather? Although I think after firing Davutoglu in 2016, Erdogan has reset or offset some of the losses of the 2011-2016 period, reset ties with Iraq, reset ties with Israel, improved ties with Greece. That hasn't necessarily meant Erdogan has abandoned his earlier policy of just supporting the Brotherhood. And I think that remains a factor that underlines Turkey's foreign policy. So a couple of explanations. I believe Erdogan is a pragmatic before he's an ideologue. And in the case of Muslim Brotherhood, I think I'm wrong. I think this is where he's more of an ideologue than he's pragmatic. And it's not necessarily that he wants the Brotherhood to succeed only. That's why he supports it. It's that he sees a bit of his past in the Brotherhood. He too comes from a movement of political Islam that was once shunned upon and sidelined. His movement came to power, and he wanted to see the same happen in Egypt and in Gaza. And he wants those parties to be given the same recognition that he was given. And he thinks that Turkey can then spread influence if Erdogan-liking Brotherhood-aligned parties are in power. But that's where I think Erdogan fails to take into account the role of historical antibodies. I think that Erdogan, Davutoglu foreign policy towards the Middle East assumed just because there were Muslims, Arabs would welcome Turkey and would love to Turkey to tell them what to do. I argue in Erdogan's empire that Arabs view Turkey not very differently than do Greeks and Serbs, former colonial overlords, because that's their historiography, and they don't want Turkey to come and tell them what to do. And I think the Pharaoh of Egypt policy for Erdogan is the biggest example of that. What doesn't matter whoever is in charge in Cairo, if it's Morsi or Sisi, Egyptians see themselves as the largest Sunni Muslim power of the Eastern Med and not Turkey. And they don't want Turkey to come and tell them what to do or to have a role in the Palestinian issue to the exclusion of the Egyptians. And I think his trip to Egypt, where he, after Morsi won elections, to counsel Morsi to be secular, a word that translates as irreligious into Arabic, also shows how some of these historical antibodies are not translatable. So I would say his foreign policy supporting Muslim Brotherhood has not only left Turkey completely isolated, but it still is one of the underlying problems that limits Erdogan's influence across Middle Eastern capitals.
Yes, please.
An intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Erdogan's number one achievement, without doubt, is that he got the Kazakhs to switch from Cyrillic alphabet to Turkish alphabet this year. Question for the paperback epilogue. Do you think that the 12 observation posts around Idlib will make it to the end of this year? And what is with that solidarity with Venezuela? So shocking.
This is a different question.
Oh, yes. Is that because to throw bone to Russia, to cozy up to the world's dictators, or is there any other sense to account for that horrible decision?
Let me start with that. So when I sketched the picture of Erdogan's palace in downtown Ankara on July 9, 2018, and went through the list of countries whose monarchs or heads of state attended Erdogan's swearing-in ceremony, I did not give you a complete list of all the 22 countries. I went through blocks and said East and West Africa, Western Balkans, Central Asia, and Caucasus. But there was a fifth block of countries present there. Underlying Erdogan's commitment to be the voice of the global South, he often starts his speeches today saying the world is greater than five, referring to the 5 permanent members of the UN, that Turkey is basically standing in for the global South. Not just Maduro was present in Erdogan's swearing-in ceremony, but also President of Zambia and Equatorial Guinea. So clearly this is also part of his broader outreach, and I think it will become maybe perhaps an irritant in Turkish ties with the West. Even if Turkey relinks with the West, that doesn't mean it won't be a perfect marriage. And one of the, I think, areas of tension is going to be Erdogan's claim to be the voice of the global South inside the Western system. On Syria, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you that I think Idlib is going to evolve very much similar to how Turkish interests in northwest Syria have evolved in the last 3 years. Following the failed coup attempt of 2016, Russia completely shifted its policy towards Turkey. Before that, Russia was pushing against Turkey, and after Turkey shut down a Russian plane that had violated Turkish airspace in November 2015, Putin slapped massive trade sanctions, threatened to shoot down Turkish auxiliaries in Syria. All of that ended. Russian bullying, threats, sanctions, following the failed coup attempt. That's because Putin realized that Erdogan was traumatized by the coup, and that Western outreach to him from Washington to European capitals was delayed. It took many leaders of Erdogan's Western allies days to reach out to him and to say, "Are you well?" Putin called him the next day, and I think Erdogan will never forget this. There are even Turkish analysts who have suggested that Putin suggested to send Erdogan Russian special ops from nearby. Who knows where they were? Even if it did, whether or not they really existed, Putin's offer, if it was indeed genuine or it was indeed voiced, I think it should have comforted Erdogan. So I think the post-coup environment is a new phase in Turkish-Russian ties. Russia continues to be Turkey's nemesis, but is no more bullying Turkey. As opposed to Russia before the coup, that was Turkey's nemesis, and that basically bullied Turkey from 1830s up until 2016. And I think Putin has used this opportunity to wedge Turkey and the US by not only reaching out to Erdogan, but also saying, what would you like in Syria? Now that the US is working with YPG, would you like to go and undermine the YPG? Erdogan said yes. He went to Jarablus. In return, Russia and its ally Assad regime got East Aleppo. Erdogan went into Afrin to take another YPG enclave. Russia and its ally Assad regime got East Ghouta. I think Idlib will see something similar. A soft power partition where those 12 observation points may be moved, where I think that Russia and its allies will have control of the M4 and the M5 highways that carry trade between as along 2 axi, east and west and north and south Syria. That means South Idlib and East Idlib. And then Turkey would have some kind of zone of influence in North and West Idlib abutting Turkish province of Hatay. And that only, I think, fits into Putin's strategy of being Turkey's nemesis, but for the time being, not bullying Turkey.
Any comment about the future of Turkey and Syria?
I feel like I'm the one talking.
Maybe I won't talk about exactly the future of Turkey and Syria, but I mean the Turkish-Russian relationship, because I think at some point it is clear that those interests will rub up against each other in Syria. But I would also say that this idea that Russia is not going to bully Turkey is, to use your phrase, Soner, permanent for now. In that the moment Putin sees that there's another opportunity, to stick it to the West in a different way, or sees a shift in sort of the balance of power, that's likely to change. So, I think Erdogan would be very wise to tread carefully, particularly in terms of flirting, with the Russians on future weapons purchases, et cetera, because it's absolutely 100% in Putin's interest to bring Turkey as far as it can, into its camp for now. But there's no strategic future there. And while at this point Turkey hasn't had to pay the price for that within NATO or with the United States, that runway is not of unlimited length.
And I think the Kurdish issue is going to be challenging how that plays out. I mean, you have Russia and Iran that want the U.S. to leave. I think it's in Turkey's interest for the U.S. to maintain some sort of a presence there, at least for now. The conversations do not seem to have been entirely fruitful during the recent trilat between the Turks, the Russians, and the Iranians. And like I alluded to earlier, this Syrian Kurdish question has yet to fully play out. And, some have speculated about whether or not the Kurds ultimately strike a deal with Assad, what that ends up meaning then to have Syrian forces all the way up on the border. So I think this is a long and complicated game to play out.
Yes, in the back, on the right.
Thank you. I'm Maya Arakon. I'm from the Georgetown University Law School of Foreign Service. I just wanted to know what you think that, Erdogan's ties with jihadist terrorism and ISIS is not a secret anymore. So, we all know that the Turkish intelligence service has provided, financial assistance or material assistance to ISIS. Why do you think that the Western leaders turn a blind eye to, this fact that he's a dictator, okay, he can deal with that, but he is the biggest contributor to the ISIS jihadist terrorism. Why do you think they do that?
Would you guys like to do this? Look, I think Erdogan may be many things, but I have to respectfully disagree with you. He's not in bed with jihadists or ISIS. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think that there are people who look at Turkish policy in Syria before, I would say, 2016, that allowed radicals to cross into Syria as saying, oh, this is Erdogan in bed with ISIS. I think the opposite is true. Turkish basic premise in Syria was always wrong. The premise was Assad will fall, good guys will take over, and they'll clean up the bad guys. So if these bad guys go and it's good, they will accelerate Assad's fall. That was completely false because it failed to take into account that Assad sectarianized the uprising and the civil war from the very beginning, established a staunch basis for him, recruited Russian-Iranian support, and made sure that he wouldn't fall. And I think Turkish engagement in Syria never adjusted to this fact. It remained in 2012, the beginning of the uprising, when it looked like the whole Syrian people were up in arms. They wanted Assad's ouster, and there was international consensus that he should go. Even U.S. leadership at this time was saying Assad should go. The Syrian crises went from being a pro-democracy uprising to a civil war with jihadists, to a non-binary war with multiple wars. I think Erdogan's foreign policy remained in the first phase. Let's have Assad go and then we'll worry about the rest later. And so I think this was more a tactical policy of hoping to accelerate the fall of Assad, not a strategic alignment.
Okay, let me close by asking one final question, and then everyone can line up to purchase their volumes of Erdogan's empire. There is among the many changes that occurs when or differences between sort of democratically elected leaders and leaders of empires is their perception of succession, their perception of what comes after them. Normally, democratic leaders don't care nearly as much because the system will produce another democratically elected leader. Leaders of empires care a lot about who comes after them. Sometimes they want to kill the people who might come after them. Sometimes they want to train and prepare who comes after them to sustain the empire they've created. So my parting question to you, Soner, is Erdogan preparing in any way for sustaining the empire that he created by helping to build a successor or a process of succession?
Probably not, because he has changed the constitution recently, as you heard, switching to an executive-style presidential system. Written into this amendment is a clause which says that any president can get elected twice. He just got elected once, so he has another term that he could win in 2023. And it also says that if the president dissolves the parliament before the completion of its term, the president can run for a third time. So I think Erdogan has basically sees himself as Turkey's president, until 2030s. I don't think he has succession in mind. I think in his mind, he's Turkey's, for the time being, permanent, I like that expression, president, until for at least another decade, going into the next decade. Now, the problem with that for Turkey is that Turkey is not Malta, obviously, meaning it's a large, complex country, demographically, economically, and I think that the switch to the presidential system, while it looks really good for Erdogan and his base, he's empowered, his political style, sultanesque, it's not necessarily the best fit for Turkey's policy environment, because the switch to the presidential system means that decision-making has been hyper-centralized in the palace at the exclusion of Turkey's traditionally very strong and very competent institutions, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to General Staff to Turkey's intelligence bodies. And those institutions no more provide input into decision-making process. That's because decision-making process has been replaced with a new one in which all channels don't count anymore. And so in some ways, that is, I think, to Erdogan's detriment. So a lot of people look at the Istanbul election or the Istanbul revote as a mistake. Erdogan won, party candidate lost the Istanbul race in March by a very narrow margin, less than 1%. The logical step for Erdogan at that point would have been to accept defeat and undermine Istanbul mayor from opposition party, simply relying on the fact that Turkey is a centralized state. Local governments rely on central governments for 2/3 of their revenue. And also Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, AKP, controls Istanbul's provincial council. It was so easy for him to let Mayor İmamoğlu take office in March and then undermine him using his financial and political levers. Instead, he called for a revote. Complete mistake, error in judgment. So one explanation brought by some analysts is that this is a result of distortion of policy making in the palace. Our colleague Dennis Ross here has a famous article in World Affairs, bulletin. It's called Coalition Maintenance in the Soviet Union, which says that decision-making in the Kremlin was distorted in the Cold War because oftentimes a decision that was made was not what was best for the Communist Party or the Soviet Union, but it is what was best for one clique to undermine another clique. I think this is where Erdogan's decision-making has been distorted in the sense that if someone told him cancel the Istanbul vote, that was not what was best for Erdogan. That was what was best for one clique that had ran the campaign, had lost it, and didn't want to be punished for it and thought they could win it the second time around. So that also bleeds, in my view, into the foreign policy realm. And if if people think Turkey has made not good decisions in Syria regarding Russia, S-400 purchase and others, expect more decisions as such, I think, going forward. because of the switch to the presidential system. So perhaps in terms of Erdogan's legacy, while he seems to have completely consolidated power, I think he's also at a fragile state because he's no more able to draw from Turkey's very competent institutions in making decisions that should be helping him and Turkey best.
Well, thank you. You heard it. At least another 10 years of Erdogan. I think you're going to violate your no more Erdogan books policy before long. Molly, Amanda, Tomasz, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for this very special event.